Good afternoon and most welcome to Heidegger 1295. We will continue with the article of Stephen M Rosen, Quantum Gravity. And I continue where I left off. Just going to pour myself a cup of tea or coffee better. Positivism becomes exorbitantly expensive when gravitation must include in the unified account of nature. Given the colossal ultramicroscopic energies required for this when point particles are assumed, the Hilbert spaces used in probabilistic analysis collapse. With finite probabilities, values no longer being assignable to terms that describe the physical states of particles. String theory's attempt to circumvent this problem and maintain positivism as a viable approach leads to the apparent contradiction we have discussed. An elementary particle with finite extension that is a point particle that is not a point particle. The particle cannot be a point if the ultramicroscopic infinities are to be avoided. And yet, the particle must be point-like. It must be indivisible if an objective analysis is to be performed. For if the particle is not elementary, if it does not have an unextended atomic character, analytical activity cannot be centered definitely in a point origin. The apparent contradiction in string theory may be seen in terms of subject and object. Until the last quarter of the 20th century, physics had done its utmost to suppress the fusion of subject and object intimated by quantum mechanics' problem of measurement. The standard model of unification had still been able to assume that the fundamental particle is simply unextended. Therefore, the separation of subject and object could continue to be upheld, at least in probabilistic approximation. The point particle is the origin of the subject, and the extended entities that are observed and analyzed by the subject are its objects. Then around 1975, when the need to deal with quantum gravity became a pressing issue, string theory entered the picture with its extended atom. Unlike the point particle of standard unification theory, the string evidently must be both indivisible and spatially extended. In effect, both subject and object. It is this implication that subverts the posture of object in space before subject that physics has long sought to maintain in its idealized quest for unification. Lee Smolin's recent book, The Trouble with Physics, opens by observing physics' current impasse. For more than 2 centuries until the present period, our understanding of the laws of nature expanded rapidly. But today, despite our best efforts, what we know for certain about these laws is no more than what we know back in the 1970s. End of quote. Smolin winds up calling for a different style of doing physics than what has been practiced since the advent of string theory. He advocates a more reflective, risky, and philosophical style that confronts the deep philosophical and foundational issues in physics. I applaud Smolin's call for a more philosophically oriented physics, and I am proposing that the recent stalemate in physics suggests it will no longer be possible for us to rely on the old philosophical foundation. With the coming to prominence of the quantum gravity issue, theoretical physics evidently has reached an unprecedented watershed. The problem confronted by string theory and by quantum gravity in general are not merely theoretical ones that can be resolved with the extant philosophical framework of object in space before subject. Rather, the difficulty lies squarely with that framework itself. The trans-Planckian dissolution of spatial continuity and fusion of subject and object strike at the very heart of the ancient formula. I therefore venture to say that any new theory presupposing said formula will fail to bring the unification that is sought. But if the long dominant tradition of philosophy is not equal to the task of effectively grounding an understanding of quantum gravity, is there any alternative philosophical foundation that can serve in this capacity? I believe the answer is yes. And now we get to phenomenological philosophy. Science recognizes its pre-scientific roots. It rightly calls attention to the ignorance and confusion that prevailed before it came into the scene. It correctly notes the benefits that were reaped with its emergence. But the science also tends to believe that it has transcended history, while it readily acknowledges that its particular methods and findings are many and varied, that they are always subject to revision and refinement. Science generally takes for granted that its posture of objectivity is beyond reproach. The assumption is that this detached stance gives us privileged access to the truth, and that it does so once and for all, exempting it from the possibility that there could be any constructive modification of it in the future. The uncritical acceptance of the objective posture has made it difficult for science to address the problem of quantum gravity, raises doubts about that posture. When confronted with the challenge of quantum gravity, most working scientists are not likely even to give serious attention to the question of science basic epistemic position. Although a few courageous physicists like Lee Smolin, very surprised, have called for revolutionary new theories based on philosophical thinking, the default setting of all philosophy remains operative, that of object in space before subject. What I am proposing is that meeting the challenge of quantum gravity requires that physics be regrounded in a new philosophy, one that can accommodate the intimate interplay of subject and object. I hasten to add that changing philosophy's setting in the way I am going to suggest will not mean losing contact with objective reality. On the contrary, it will mean that the analyst observer, in relinquishing the stance of detached anonymity, will become more closely engaged with the down-to-earth facts of reality than ever before. Over the past century, the classical tradition has been questioned by the proponents of the philosophical initiative known as existential phenomenology. I will briefly describe the general features of this approach and its historical influence on physics. and will then focus on a specific concept in phenomenology that has an immediate bearing on the matter before us. We shall see that the idea of depth, advanced by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, responds to the challenge of quantum gravity by offering a new understanding of object, subject, and space. The phenomenological movement is rooted in the 19th century existentialist writings of thinkers like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky. It takes its contemporary form through the work of its principal figures, Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. In terms of the present article, phenomenology can be seen most essentially as a critique of the classical trichotomy of object in space before subject. To the phenomenologist, the activities of the detached Cartesian subject are idealizing objectifications of the world that conceal the concrete reality of the life world. Obscured by the lofty abstractions of European science, the earthy realms this earthy realm of lived experience is inhabited by subjects that are non-anonymous, that do not fly above the world, exerting their influence from afar. In the life world, the subject is a fully situated, fully fledged participant, engaging in transactions so intimately entangling that it can no longer rightly be taken as separated either from its objects or from the worldly context itself. It is clear that all three terms of the classical formulation are affected by the phenomenological move. Again, on the classical account, the object is what is experience, and the subject is the transcendent perspective from which the experience is had, and space is the continuous medium through which the experience occurs. In this approach, objects are taken as simply external to each other and as appearing within a spatial continuum of sheer externality. Space's infinite divisibility, or in Heidegger's words, the outside of one another, of the multiplicity of points. The agents operating upon the objects entail a third mode of external relationship, acting as they do from a transcendent vantage point beyond the objects in space. It is this classical privileging of external relations that is counteracted in the phenomenological approach. Notwithstanding the Platonic Cartesian idealization of the world in the underlying life word, that there is no object with boundaries so sharply that define that it is closed off completely from other objects. The life world is characterized instead by the transpermeation of objects, by the mutual interpenetration, by the reciprocal insertion and intertwining of one in the other, as Merleau-Ponty puts it. With objects thus related by way of mutual containment, no separate container is required to mediate their relations, as would have to be the case with externally related objects. Phenomenological understanding supersedes the classical relationship of container and contain. Objects no longer are to be thought of as contained in space like things in a box, for in containing each other they contain themselves. At the same time, it must also be understood that in the life world there can be no peremptory division of object and subject. The life world subject, far from being the disengaged, finds itself down among the objects, is one of the visibles, is itself always an object to some other subject, so that the simple distinction between subject and object is confounded, and we no longer know which sees and which is seen. The phenomenological grounding of the subject is thus indicative of the close interplay of the subject and object in the life world. Generally speaking, then, what the move from classical thinking to phenomenology essentially entails is an internalization of the relations among subject, object, and space. Despite the continuing dominance of Cartesianism in contemporary physics, it is interesting to note that the phenomenology of Husserl and Heidegger did have an impact on some of the founders of quantum theory. Eugen Wigner, for example, had encountered Husserl at the University of Göttingen and knew Heidegger through Michael Polanyi, Wigner's colleague and mentor. These influences were reflected in Wigner's approach to physics. Another example is Werner Heisenberg's correspondence with Heidegger, which led Heisenberg to contribute an article on particle physics to a Festschrift for Heidegger. The connection between phenomenology and physics is further evidenced in the work of scientists and philosophers such as Hermann Weyl, Joseph Kuckelmans, and Pierre Kertzberg. A pivotal figure is Patrick Heelan, who studied with Wigner and Heisenberg and has pioneered efforts to apply phenomenological investigations to the philosophy of space and of quantum mechanics. Now the beginnings of a specific phenomenological response to the problem of quantum gravity can be found in the work of Merleau-Ponty. In his concept of depth, he provides an account of dimensionality that permits us to understand the limitations of Cartesian space and to surpass them. I will describe Merleau-Ponty's approach in the following section, and then to attempt to clarify it in the section after that. 3.2. Depth, the primary dimension. By way of introducing Merleau-Ponty's depth dimension, let us consider once more the traditional dichotomy between objects contained in space and their spatial container, or as Plato put it, between that which becomes and that in which it becomes. This approach to space ultimately devitalizes the world, renders it immobile, because whatever changes may transpire in the objects that become, however they may be transformed, the containing space, the Platonic receptacle itself, does not change. Indeed, for there to be change, there must be difference, contrast, opposition of some kind. But the point elements that make up the classical continuum, rather than entailing opposition, involve mere juxtaposition, being unextended and thus devoid of inner structure. The elements of space possesses no gradation of depth, no shading, texture or nuance, no contrasts or distinctions of any sorts. Instead of expressing the interplay of shadow and light, space itself is all light, as it were a condition of total exposure prevails for the point elements of the continuum. Since these elements, having no interior recesses, must be said to exist solely on the outside, all that could be said of the relations among such eviscerated beings is what Heidegger said. The points of classical space are outside of one another. So rather than actively engaging each other, as do the beings that are contained in space, the densely packed elements of the classical container sit inertly side by side, like identical beads on a string. As a matter of fact, even though the beings that dwell in such space can be said to be actively engaged, the quality of their interaction is affected by the context in which they are embedded, since the continuum is constituted by sheer externality. Sheer externality. Indeed, for there to be change, there must be difference. The relations among its inhabitants must also be external. Classical dynamics are essentially mechanistic, instead of involving a full-fledged dialectic of opposition and identity, wherein beings influence each other from core to core. Influence is exerted in a more superficial fashion. According to David Bohm, the mechanistic order of influence is one in which entities interact through forces that do not bring about any changes in their essential nature. They interact only through some kind of external contact. We may say then that classical space contains dialectical process in such a way that it externalizes it, divesting it of its depth and vitality. In Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological approach, we see that the classical space, appearing to contain dialectical process, actually originates from it. In his essay I and Mind, Merleau-Ponty emphasizes the absolute positivity of traditional Cartesian space. For Descartes, space is simply there, possessing no faults or nuances. It is utterly explicit openness, the sheer positive extension that constitutes the field of strictly external relations, wherein unambiguous measurement can be made. Classical space, says Merleau-Ponty, remains absolutely in itself, everywhere equal to itself, homogeneous. Its dimensions, for example, are interchangeable. He concludes that for Descartes, space is purely positive being, outside all points of view, beyond all latency and all depth, having no true thickness. Challenging the Cartesian view, Merleau-Ponty insists that the dialectical features of perceptual experience, such as perspectival, opposition, gradation, or depth, are not merely secondary to space, that itself is devoid of such features. He begins his own account on spatiality by exploring the paradoxical interplay of the visible and invisible, of difference and identity, that is characteristic of true depth. The enigma consists, this is a quote, in the fact that I see things, each of its own place, precisely because they eclipse one another, that they are rivals before my sight. Precisely because each one is in its own place. Their exteriority is known in their envelopment, and their mutual dependence in their autonomy. Once depth is understood this way, we can no longer call it a third dimension. In the first place, if it were a dimension, it would be the first one. There are forms and definite planes only if it's stipulated how far from me the different parts are. But a first dimension that contains all the others is no longer a dimension, at least in the ordinary sense of a certain relationship according to which we make measurements. Depth, thus understood, is rather the experience of the reversibility of dimensions, of a global locality, everything in the same place at the same time, a locality from which height, width and depth are abstracted. And I would say, this is my add-on, nullified. This is a very similar point as made by Rodolphe Gasquet in The Tale of the Mirror. The classical dimensions are devoid of depth, of reality, of what makes anything real, which is difference in homogeneity, like having different features, properties, things that we can recognize, learn, see, experience. No, the Cartesian space is devoid of all that, and the metaphor of the canvas is not really apt, because a canvas has a structure, it has a grain, it has a materiality. Makes sense. Cartesian space is just an abstraction from an abstraction of an abstraction. And we just put a point there and end. I say thank you very much. So interesting with Merleau-Ponty. I think it's maybe time to take him up to the lecture level. Have a very pleasant afternoon, and bye bye for now.